Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you of the upcoming ranked reward for the next 3 seasons. This is a tier 10 Chinese tank destroyer. It is the 114 SP2, and from the front this vehicle looks a lot like a Jagdtiger, but it's only when you take a look at its clear turret ring and from its side view that you realize that this is a completely different kind of tier 10 tank destroyer with a fully traversable turret and a gun that definitely makes it better than a heavy tank within that regard. However, it does have quite a few weaknesses, which let's get stuck into and compare to some of the current tank destroyers in the game. So the SP2 will be the first tier 10 tank destroyer since the Waffenträger Alpha E100 to have a fully traversable turret, because vehicles like the T110E4 can go 90 degrees to the left, 90 degrees to the right, a lot like the FV4005, while the Guerrilla can go 50 degrees to the left and 50 degrees to the right, and non-turreted tank destroyers like the Object 268 version 4 are usually limited to about a 24-degree gun arc in front of the vehicle where the gun is still flexible. However, even though this thing is going to have a fully traversable turret, we can clearly see that compared to all of the other turreted tanks in the game, that this one does not lack the damage per minute. And that's because it's 152mm caliber gun, which I should stress is 152, because that means that its armor-piercing rounds are going to overmatch all 50mm caliber plates, unlike tanks like the Guerrilla, for example, has a very decent rate of fire of 14.17 rounds a minute. Although, like the Object 268 version 4, it does have an under-gunned alpha damage for a tier 10 tank destroyer of 650. To go along with this, the penetration is a little bit lackluster on the tank. 273, which is worse than the Guerrilla, which has one of the worst penetrations, along with the AMX 50 Foch B. The premium rounds on the 114 SP2 are 329mm of penetration. That's neither good nor bad, but it does have disappointing high explosive rounds. 840 alpha damage and 90mm of penetration mean that you're not really going to be able to take advantage of softly armored targets like you can on a T110E4, for example, and other full-blooded tank destroyers. Nevertheless, on playing this vehicle, I can clearly feel that DPM advantage that it has over other turreted tank destroyers, and the fact that it's flexible on a ridge line while also still having one of the better damage per minutes of any tier 10 tank destroyer definitely gives this one a clear advantage. A passing mention should be made to the plethora of ammunition that you can take on the 114 SP2. This is a little bit disappointing that the high explosive rounds are so poor that you're not really going to be wanting to take many of those like you can on many other tank destroyers. So now onto the gun handling. Usually vehicles which have fully traversable turrets have better gun handling than those that don't. And there is no exception here, apart from when we look at something like the Object 268 version 4. But there's a clear reason why that is arguably, and in my opinion, the Object 268 version 4 being the best tier 10 tank destroyer in the game. So the 114 SP2 actually has really good aim time at 2 seconds. It's not quite as good as the Guerrilla, but it's definitely not bad. The accuracy on the tank at 0.32, again, this is really good for a tier 10 tank destroyer. Not nearly as good as the Guerrilla, but that one is a laser pointer, only second to the Stridsvagn 103B at tier 10. And 0.32 on the 114 SP2 is definitely going to work for you well. One thing that I really liked about this tank was the gun handling. It is a little bit worse than the Object 268 version 4, but a lot of things are worse than the Object 268 version 4. But still, to have 0.12 traverse speed when you're turning the turret, unlike the T110E4 and the Guerrilla, means that it doesn't really bloom out that much. So unlike those two tanks, where I would recommend that you use a rotation device on, you can hands down get away without using a rotation device on the 114 SP2 because its bloom is not the worst, especially when you combine it with gunner skills like Snapshot and when you combine it with driver skills like Smooth Ride. One thing that I really liked about this vehicle as well was the elevation. 20 degrees means that you're very flexible at aiming your gun up at tanks that may be above you or maybe when you're just traveling down slope. And 7 degrees of gun depression means that this thing is flexible, has the same amount of gun depression as the recently buffed Object 140 or other vehicles like the WZ-111-5A. It is a healthy amount of gun depression. It gives you that little bit of extra flexibility compared to tanks like the T110E4, and massive amounts more flexibility than the Object 268 version 4 for working a ridgeline. So now onto the mobility of the 114 SP2, and this is where it's both good and bad news for the tank. 45 kilometers an hour forwards is very healthy for a tank destroyer, unlike the T110E4, but it is behind the Gorilla, significantly behind the Gorilla, and behind the Object 268 version 4 as well. The real problem with the SP2, the 114, is that even though its power to weight ratio is pretty good, it's actually not too far behind the Object 268 version 4 and better than the T110E4, this vehicle has horrendous ground resistances. 1.8 on hard, 2 on medium, and this is horrendous. And it means that this tank's effective top speed limit is just over 30 on hard terrain and sub 29 on medium terrain, making it actually slower than the T110E4 unless you're going down slope, or alternatively you boost other aspects of the tank to be able to make it go faster than the T110E4's limited top speed limit. The 114 SP2 is a tank that, in my opinion, demands a turbocharger on many maps to be able to try and pump up the engine power. Also, crew skills like off-road driving and anything including field mods, as I'll highlight in a second, to be able to improve the ground resistances of this tank can revolutionize the speed that you can be able to achieve. Players out there who don't make use of all of those tools to be able to improve the vehicle's mobility will find this thing being very slow indeed for a rather large and ill-armored tank. One thing that I loved about this tank, however, was the reverse speed. 18 kilometers an hour backwards allows you to pull back quickly from a ridgeline where you've just delivered that killer shot against your opponents. The vehicle is also quite heavy at 63 tons, meaning that this is a good tank for ramming your opponents, unlike something like the Gorilla. And considering it does have a fairly healthy top speed limit, it's never going to be like a 268 version 4 for ramming, but it'll be very decent. But be warned that its armor is not great, as I'm going to cover in a second. The vehicle's turret traverse is 18 degrees, worse than the Gorilla, and worse than the gun traverse on the Object 268 version 4, but that tank doesn't have a turret. And the vehicle's tank traverse at 30 is not too bad, but keep in mind that the ground resistances kind of hold back the tank traverse. And while it does have the best traverse speeds in this comparison, they're still not fabulous like you would have on the faster heavy tanks or any of the mediums. So now onto the armor of the SP14-2, and you can clearly see it's not good news for this tank. 75 at the front, 75 at the side of the hull, and 50 at the back, and 135 at the front of the turret and 75 on the turret. That is not very good when you also take into account that this tank's armor is very flat. If I show you at the visual here, we can see that the hull armor never really goes above about 130 millimeters of effective, and the turret front never really gets good either. It does have some freaky spots, but that was probably because Tanks GG was actually hitting the gun. If we go to the collision model here, or should I say the live model here, you can see you aren't ricocheting much when you are fighting even against a T44, which I'm comparing it to. Let me clarify, ladies and gents, what you see is not the SP2, the 114 SP2 shooting itself. This is as if a T44 was shooting it. Yeah, this is one of your run-of-the-mill tier 8 tanks just going through this vehicle every single time. Even if you are using your gun depression in this tank, the turret armor never really gets more than about 170 millimeters of effectiveness, so that's not going to work. However, it will protect you against high explosive rounds. You'll be able to take an artillery hit. You're going to be able to take rounds from pesky EBRs or other tank destroyers that try and fire high explosive rounds at you. They're still going to hurt you significantly because your armor's not super thick, but it's not like they're going to penetrate you and do 100% of their damage potential. The only real use of this armor is trying to pull off a miracle ricochet when somebody shoots you from the side. Unlike the Gorilla, which is you're going to be overmatched, you will occasionally be able to pull off some ricochets. But the main strength of the tank will be its side armor. Do you see how, like with a WZ-111-5A or some of the Soviet tanks, it has this wing of angled armor? This means that you can over-angle it like this and sometimes still pull off miracle ricochets down the side of the tank. It also means that if you side scrape against somebody who for some reason thinks that's a big turret, I won't be able to pen that, and they try to shoot your side, that you will be able to ricochet them. And so that's a last-ditch attempt against somebody who maybe doesn't know how to handle these tanks. And while you're not going to see them on the battlefield for a very significant amount of time, unless you get to meet somebody like me, a Wargaming community contributor, just shoot this thing in the turret. It's going to be the easiest thing to be able to pen in the turret, and any vehicle, even your tier 8s, are going to be able to dominate it like that. So the vehicle has a good amount of hit points, 2,000. It's definitely going to be enough for the tank. And one thing that I should mention is vehicle's camera rating is actually pretty good because it's not the tallest of tanks. And so it has double the camera rating of the Gorilla, double the camera rating of the T110E4. And so you can actually get this up to a very healthy level with a concealment crew and, you know, all of your other kind of crew skills that will be adding to it. The view range of the vehicle at 390 means that most players are not going to want to take coated optics on this tank unless you're not willing to use a premium consumable and you don't have a very good crew. And a final mention should be made to the fact that the tank has a 15% chance to be set on fire. So now for a first in a tank review, I want to talk about the field mods. This isn't something that I can keep ignoring. So the field mods that I will be choosing for this vehicle, I'll be taking the reinforced suspension. This will increase my suspension durability by 30%, and also importantly, it's going to improve it's going to improve my ability to maintain speed when crossing all terrain types by 15%, which is revolutionary on this tank. If you do not take this, you are an absolute donkey and your vehicle is going to be horrendous. And in fact, it's so broken at the moment that you're actually going to have better hull traverse than if you took the one that's meant to improve your hull traverse. I have no idea why you would ever take a lightweight suspension instead of a reinforced suspension on pretty much any tank right now, let alone this one. I'm also going to have worse aim time on this tank, but better accuracy by taking the parallax adjustment. I'm going to take a right-angled periscope to be able to improve my view range on this tank. And with that, even without having coated optics, I'm able to get 471 meters view range, although that is pimping it out with a directive as well, so watch out for that. But concealment after firing, your concealment after firing is so bad anyway that you don't really need to improve that. You'd be a fool to not take the increased view range there. For loading mechanism, I'm going to improve the reload time, have a little bit longer aim time because DPM is key, and this tank has so the DPM to boot. And finally, I am going to make my aim time worse by 3% to improve the engine power by 4%, because remember, this thing has horrible mobility because of its ground resistances, and so you want to do everything that you can to be able to improve those and to pump up the engine power to try and get it up towards that 45 km/h base speed limit. I am using Bond equipment on this tank for this tank review, but I felt like I wanted to test it out like all of the Clan Wars players, not the Clan Wars players because this isn't a Clan Wars tank, the ranked players are going to, and you're probably going to take a plethora of Bond equipment to be able to have on your new toy. Crew-wise, this vehicle works perfectly well with the WZ-113 GFT, so you can take your crew from that tank and put it on this one, and it's going to work absolutely perfectly. If you don't have the Chinese tank destroyer, but you end up getting this tank, I thoroughly recommend you have a premium commander, because the commander is also the radio operator, and you're clearly having to focus on recon and situational awareness to pump up the poor view range of the tank. But anyway, let's take this sniper tank destroyer with a fully traversable turret and good DPM out onto the battlefield for some action. Alright, so first game, I'm going to be playing in a nice matchup on Siegfried Line. Now, what am I going to do on Siegfried Line? Well, I'm going to try and use the momentum that we have going down the slope to completely change positions. I don't really like this northern position unless I have maybe something like a Kranvang to be able to work the extra gun depression that we have. On this vehicle, I do feel a little bit limited, but not incredibly limited with the way that the gun depression works. 7 degrees. You should know from vehicles like the Object 140 where you can try and make a tank like this work. The problem is that when you have a big old turret on top of the tank, including a weak point, or shall I say just an extra bit of height to the all-round weak point that is this tank. It's not like a WT Alpha 100 used to be with regards to being able to penetrate it all with high explosive rounds, but look, this thing is not great. I'd also like to clarify, we are down to 36 kilometers an hour along the flat here. And keep in mind, that is with a maxed out crew. That is with every crew skill available because I'm playing on my press account. And it also is with a Bond turbo. And it's with taking the correct field modifications as well. 28 along slope like this. This is not a fast tank destroyer. If I was a Gorilla, I would already be into position. I would have probably already got a shot on the 50 TP that was over towards my north. This is not a tank destroyer that you can go and whip it around like you can in a Stridsvagn 103B, for example. It's not going to be the fastest tank into position. I've already used up 15% of this total game just being able to get over here. But now I'm in this position. Let's see what we can do with it. Look at this gun handling. Fully traversable turret, boys and girls. Great aim time, great accuracy, and a good reload to boot. And also fast and nimble in position as well. Doesn't really look like a tank destroyer right in this kind of a scenario. Definitely feels more like a glass cannon medium-y tank that's also quite big, or even a heavy tank. This thing is an absolute enigma to review because there's so many things that I hate about it. It's awful armor, the fact that it's not fast, the fact that it doesn't really have a full tank destroyer gun, but it's near enough having a full tank destroyer gun. I don't think anyone could claim it was like a heavy tank gun or a weaker medium tank gun. But there's just enough to also love about this thing on a ridgeline where it does feel absolutely phenomenal. So unfortunately for me, when I went and punished the 60 TP, I also get hit by a Char Future 4. And that's definitely one thing that I want to highlight about not enjoying about this tank. I'm firing a gold round there down on the 60 TP's armor, and we are out trading them. But if there's one thing that I really don't like in this scenario, boys and girls, it is the fact that I just took 3 rounds from a Char Future 4 with absolutely no chance to be able to bounce them. They didn't need to fire heat there. They could have fired armor-piercing rounds, and they would have all gone into my tank. The heat was just that little bit of extra salt in my wounds. But there's one thing that I wanted to highlight, and that is that when you've only got 650 alpha damage, it doesn't really feel as if we're trading as well as other tank destroyers do. If I'm in something like a T110E4 in this scenario, having that 750 alpha damage, or even if I'm in a Grilla, having that 750 alpha damage, just feels that it's just so much better. In those tanks, I would be up to 2,250 damage right now. In this vehicle, even with penetrating all of those shells, we're at 2,500. That 100 damage, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it does make a difference on the tank for when you're wanting to try and work a ridgeline. And remember, because this thing has no armor, it's only really its hit points that keep it in it to be able to make those trades. And so you better hope that you're actually shooting against something that has significantly lower alpha damage than you, or you're able to use your flexibility to be able to get an ambush shot, because otherwise the hit points of this thing don't feel like they go a long way when a lot of people are trying to hit 4,000 damage per game, and a lot of people will. A lot of the ranked players will be looking for that in this kind of a tank. And I know that I'll only feel like I've had a good game once I've started to reach that kind of level as well. It does require a lot of shots, and in this kind of a situation, we're very fortunate that we get to work the ridge line, get to be a little bit flexible. And while it definitely doesn't have the traverse speeds on the turret of a medium, this is without a rotation device, and it's perfectly usable. It's absolutely perfectly usable. Once you've got yourself a good amount of crew skills, and if you're willing to use a premium consumable on this tank as well, everything will help there. And you see that our gun handling, with that great accuracy, with a short aim time, and with decent bloom, even when we're turning the turret fully, it definitely feels as if we're very consistent. I do love this gun. If I could have this gun on a medium tank, or if I could have this gun on something that had just a little bit better armor, I definitely would. It's definitely kind of a medium tank plus. It's funny though, because on a vehicle like this, once you start to have the 273 millimeters of pen, it doesn't really feel that much better than like a Leopard or a K91, for example. It's not like 290, which you feel that tier 10 tank destroyers should have. So Wargaming are definitely trying to file off the different niceties that you can have on a tank destroyer to, I guess, try and balance out this vehicle. They're trying to make it slow. They're trying to make it as if it doesn't have that comfortable penetration. They're trying to make it so that it doesn't have that great alpha damage. They're trying to do everything that they possibly can to balance out the statistics of this tank so it doesn't become something overpowered or unbalanced like the WT Alpha E100 was. But anyway, I don't get another lick of this standard B, so let's move on into our next gameplay and see how this tank does more in a brawly kind of close quarters situation. So now we're spawning in on Himmelsdorf against tier 10 tanks, and take a look at our speed even when we're going along the flat of hard terrain. We are down to about 37, although keep in mind that I've used the field modifications to switch out my turbo for the extra hit points and our track durability. And oh my lord, I can feel it. 13 kilometers an hour up this slope without a turbo. It definitely feels as if it's more of a heavy tank with regards to its mobility now than a faster tank destroyer. Again, like I said on Siegfried Line, something like a Griller or a Stridsvagn 103B would be bombing its way up the slope. Look at the VZ55. The VZ55 is leaving me in its dust. And the UDES, the 430U, and the Batchat have already started to instigate the fight. An Object 268 version 4 is already up there, raring to get into position, and I do feel as if I'm missing out. And it's funny because just because I've dropped the turbo and a Bond turbo to boot, suddenly this vehicle is going to be a lot more realistic with the idea of what the mobility might be like for all of you if you unlock it and you don't set it up in arguably the correct way, or at least an aggressive way, and you don't have the field mods, and if you don't have the extra bond turbo, or even just you don't want to put a regular turbo on this tank, then it could be a little bit awkward for you. Alright, so here we go. 114 SP2 in this situation against an Object 268 version 4. Boom! Right through the tracks. That feels good. He's boosting his hit points, I believe, on Object 268 version 4, so he should repair his tracks quickly, but this tank has the alpha damage to keep those tracks off. So the 268 version 4 is going to put a round into us, and oh dear, the Object 430U just shunted that Object 268 version 4 up into a position that I didn't even think it was possible to be able to get up there. But luckily, our great rate of fire means that we can follow up one of our shells with a subsequent shell on the Object 268 version 4, and we're reloaded to go after the 430U as well. Look at this thing's DPM. I personally would recommend to take a gun rammer and vents in this tank, come what may. And then your final slot will either be a turbo. Oh, that was a bit of an awkward bounce, but I should have aimed at the lower plate there of the bat chat. And I'm going to lose some health points for it as well. How annoying is that? I'd recommend that in addition to those two modules that you go for either a turbo or maybe the improved durability, or if you really want to, you could use a rotation device, but I think that would be a misplay on this tank. I think that the first thing that I would put on this tank is a turbo, because otherwise it feels incredibly slow. So, what? Maybe that's the slightly poor penetration coming in there. We actually bounce off of the turret armor of an AMX 50B, and suddenly I am not feeling too happy after bouncing off the bat chat and bouncing off the 50B. But I think that's more just, you know, kind of like French armor just trolling you with its angles rather than the poor penetration on the tank. But then again, you know, every little helps on this vehicle. So we're going to try and fire clutch there at the 430U. And while this thing does have a fully traversable turret and we can take those chancy shots, you can see that it didn't quite work out for us there. But luckily in this scenario, because I've got the turret and I feel like I'm more of a medium tank or a heavy tank, I can get forwards and try and help this VZ55 out. Now we've got to kite this T124, and remember the T124, as I showed you with the statistics analysis, actually has the better grunt in the engine and the ground resistances to be able to get up that slope. And so will I be able to avoid? I was quite a nice guy there, actually. I didn't block the VZ55. If I'd taken the inside corner, I would have probably got the player killed, but I would have been able to survive. But I took the outside. I guess I got lucky that they managed to. The T124 missed me, and so the VZ55 comes around the corner, and I say, spicy balshoi to the VZ55 in that scenario. So we've both managed to get through, picking up 7 kills between us on top of the hill in quite a nice frenetic fight. The reason why I wanted to show you that one was because, do you see just how kind of good this vehicle is compared to other tank destroyers for those kind of frenetic fights? It has the DPM, it has the turret, it has the gun handling, it also has a little bit of the mobility. In those kind of scenarios, this vehicle felt incredibly nice. And we can use intuition to be able to put the final shot into the back of the griller. More gameplay. Let's see how it does. So let's join the 114 SP2 in one of the most awkward situations for a tank destroyer. When you're trying to shoot at vehicles that are kind of behind trees, they're kind of behind rocks, and you can see that I'm there trying to feather out the shot to see if I can find a shell on the 7032. In these kind of scenarios, usually tank destroyers are awkward because they have to face their hull towards the enemy. They don't have the luxury of a fully traversable turret, and so they can't be positioned so that they can pull back quickly behind the ridge as they fire. But you can see, with the flexibility of having a turret on the 114 SP2, we can actually turn our turret and we can pull back behind the ridge in case we get spotted. And when we find that we don't get spotted because our sixth sense doesn't go off, then we can go back up to be able to give another shot. And this tank still has one of the better damage per minutes of any of the tier 10 tank destroyers. And so it really does start to clock up the damage quickly. And it also still has the mobility to be able to get forwards, at least down the slope there. When I'm now using the turbo on this tank, and we can put one into the back of the Stridsvagn 103B. And I decide, why not sit here? Apart from the T30 that might be towards the south, there's not too much that we have to worry about. And maybe we can even manage to get the extra shot in against the Stridsvagn 103B. So the Skoda T27 puts 2 rounds into us. It's not a tank that should be penetrating a tier 10 tank destroyer very reliably, but this one isn't really a well-armored tier 10 tank destroyer. But luckily, our side armor manages to bounce one of the shots, and look at that aim time. Even with taking some of the field modifications that make the aim time worse to make the other aspects of the tank better, the aim time is still very decent at that, and the gun handling's good, and that allows us to put 2 quick rounds into the Skoda T27, finishing them off, picking up our 3rd kill. And you see in this tank review just how quickly the 114 SP2 and how reliably it seems to be able to pick up the damage. When I'm playing my other tank destroyers, my shells often miss. When I'm playing my other tank destroyers, my gun handling doesn't feel like it's good enough, and I'm quite often aiming for far too long to actually be able to get the damage per minute out, or alternatively, I'll just have awkward gun handling of vehicles that are moving and I'm not going to be able to connect the shots. Now, it would be unfair of me to not highlight that the poor armor on this tank, in situations where you don't get to work ridge lines and you don't manage to clap your opponents at decent distances, just feels a little bit awkward. But to have that flexibility, the reasonable amount of mobility, the aim time, the fully traversable turret, this tank just feels absolutely awesome in these kind of progressive ridgeline fights, where it's not all about side-scraping around a corner, it's not all about sitting there, hold down, only exposing your turret against your opponents, but, you know, the kind of flowing gameplay, the kind of gameplay that, from like a world of tanks that time forgot. Now, you're not always going to be able to get matchups like this. You're not always going to be able to have these kind of games that flow, right? Everybody knows that. But when you do, this vehicle kind of totally blurs the line between the idea of a medium tank and a heavy tank and a tank destroyer. And so for some people, I can tell you, they are absolutely going to adore this tank because it does feel like a bit of a hybrid. If you love the Gorilla, like me, I think you're going to like this tank as well. If you like having a really big hitting gun that punishes, but still having the DPM to be able to make use of it, yeah, this is one of the harder hitting high DPM tanks in the game. But again, it wouldn't be fair of me not to highlight just how much this armor sucks and how big and easy of a target it is for hit for even the most inaccurate of tanks. But be warned, because sometimes you're going to be trying to take swings at the EBR 105 and expecting him to zig, but instead they zag or they just don't manage to do anything. And then it's going to frustrate you a little bit more, and you're going to be like, I got to get this EBR, I've got to get rid of the vision on the enemy team, and then you're going to realize all of a sudden that, oh, yes. Oh, there's an FV4005 on the enemy team. That's a real hard-hitting tank destroyer, unlike me. And when you don't have any armor, you don't have much protection against 230 millimeters of high explosive squashed head rounds. And so I expect that, irrelevant of this vehicle looking good on a ridgeline, and me making this tank look pretty darn awesome for those kind of scenarios, I can't see this tank being flat out overpowered, because when it gets spotted, it is oh so vulnerable. And I think that a lot of the strengths of this vehicle will be for the player to know when that's about to happen, and using your mobility, concealment, and knowledge of positions and good use of bush mechanics to be able to try to make it not in the first place. So our first round on Siegfried Line was a high caliber for our 5,300 damage dealt, 50% more than anyone else on our team was able to achieve. Our next round on Himmelsdorf didn't yield any battle hero medals, but it was actually one of the higher base experience games that I managed to achieve with this vehicle, and that was because we were able to spot for ourselves, and the 4,800 damage does put us on top. In our third round, we get another high caliber medal and a tank sniper, and this thing is going to pick up a lot of tank snipers with an accurate gun that does do decent damage at range. 5,500 damage and 1,047 base experience. Again, 50% more damage than the rest of our, well, anyone on our team was able to achieve individually. The 114 SP2, all in all, do I think it's going to be the next best tank of World of Tanks? No, I feel like the only kind of tanks that truly break the matchmaker are usually those that either have outrageous autoloading potential, some kind of crazy mechanic like a Hesh round on a 4005, but more importantly, tanks that have thick, sturdy armor. One of the things that makes a vehicle able to achieve outrageous results in World of Tanks is having some armor. I got penned 6 out of 7 times on the final game that we played. I got penned 3 out of 3 times on the second, and I got penned 3 out of 3 games on the first game that we played as well. And we didn't have too many hit points left to boot on either of those rounds. This thing just doesn't have the protection for it to be outrageously overpowered, Although it is still going to be an absolute deadly tank to leave unaccounted for on a ridge line, and considering that this is going to be a ranked reward, you should also expect that the kind of players who are going to be playing this tank, a lot like the ones who have been playing in the Concept 1B so far, are going to be quite deadly players, at least for the first half a year of the vehicle's release, before most likely Wargaming are going to probably put it in the Bond store during the next year's iteration of Ranked. So, the 114 SP2. I don't think this thing's going to be breaking the matchmaker anytime soon. Be warned for its side armor, however. Is it worth playing Ranked to be able to get? Well, I probably wouldn't go out of my way to play Ranked to be able to get this tank. I mean, what are you even really going to use it for anyway? You can't play it in Ranked. I guess you could play it in some of your clan wars. You can't even really play it in the competitive game mode because obviously there are no reward tanks available in it. Are you going to want it to really crew train your 113 GFT, the tank that hardly anybody plays at all? Yeah, probably not. I think this vehicle is interesting enough and different enough in flavor to justify its position in the game. But really, from a point of interest, it being a Chinese tank destroyer that nobody's really bothered about, not having any outrageous features, really, that no other tanks can already do in the game, I think the SP2, the 114, is going to be a tank that a lot of people forget about. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this tank review. If you did, give it a thumbs up, but if you hated it, give it a thumbs down and let me know in the comments what you think about the 114 SP2. Do you think this vehicle looks absolutely incredible? Are you now going to try your hardest that you possibly can in rank to be able to get it? Or do you think it looks like a bit of a disappointment? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.